You come to me and ask me for a favor, but you do so without respect. Most of you probably recognize this famous line from Don Corleone in The Godfather, along with the well-known image of the mafia world. Guys in double-breasted suits, handkerchiefs in their pockets, fedoras, holding Tommy guns, accompanied by beautiful women, glasses of whiskey, and that whole wild party atmosphere. They shoot at each other, somehow get involved in show business. That's the mafia as we picture it. Today, we're going to talk about the mafia. But of course, it's not some operetta-style structure. This is real. These are very serious people. These are organizations that have been evolving for 2 centuries, and all the talk about conspiracies or a world government, in many ways, everything I'll tell you today aligns quite closely with the actions of criminal syndicates. And if we are to talk about a so-called world government, then first and foremost, we should be talking about them. So what is the mafia, objectively speaking? The term mafia, its etymology, is still not entirely clear. There's a common claim that mafia is actually an acronym from a Sicilian patriotic slogan, Morte alla Francia, Italia anela. Death to France, Italy yearns. Taking the first letters of each word forms the word M-A-F-I-A. For nearly 2 centuries, Sicily was under the control of various foreign powers. It was constantly fighting for independence. On the island, groups began to form that could be called national resistance or partisan units, national defense forces. In reality, they were semi-criminal groups of tough Sicilian men who had their own hierarchy, their own leaders, and who fought against the French occupiers at the time. Objectively speaking, the term mafia only became international in relation to the American mafia, but the origins of the structure lie with Sicilian criminal groups. The Sicilian mafia is known as Cosa Nostra, our thing, and to this day, that's the name of the organization. Starting in the mid-19th century, as Italy moved toward unification, the newly formed Italian kingdom began to employ Sicilians for the king's personal security and for all sorts of difficult assignments, espionage, assassinations, and so on. You couldn't exactly call them a private military company, but they were essentially paramilitary enforcers, ruthless men who were, in fact, serving the Italian kingdom. The bosses of Cosa Nostra had friendly ties with the Italian aristocracy, and there was nothing particularly shameful about that at the time. At the same time, it's clear that these men were gaining power and started engaging in criminal enterprises in Sicily. What kind of crime are we talking about during that period? First of all, smuggling. Second, emerging corruption, extortion, protection rackets. Though it wasn't even called racketeering back then. These were payments that Cosa Nostra collected in exchange for protection. Protection of businesses, artisans, and local tradespeople. At that point, it was all still very regional and relatively small scale, not serious in terms of financial volume, but the organizational structure was already in place. Cosa Nostra had strict discipline, its own code of laws and rules, a code that continues to function to this very day. That included blood feuds and strict secrecy. You couldn't talk about mafia business with anyone outside the family. Toward the end of the 19th century, Italy's economic situation worsened, and many Italians began emigrating to America. It wasn't just Sicilians. Neapolitans, Calabrians, people from all over Italy who were poor, uncomfortable, or simply seeking new opportunities started arriving in the United States. They settled in New York and began trying to make a living, and they brought with them the values and ways of life they had known in Italy. By the early 20th century, 2 major Italian criminal groups had formed in New York. One was the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, and the other was Camorra, a mafia group originally from Naples. These 2 Italian organizations began fighting for control over New York's underworld. But before they could carve up the city's business scene, they first had to confront the existing local enforcers, the Irish gangs. You've probably seen the movie Gangs of New York, which depicts this period quite vividly. Late 19th century, gentlemen with revolvers shooting, killing, and engaging in all sorts of criminal activity. Into this world came the Italians, already equipped with a well-defined criminal hierarchy. Boss, underboss, consigliere, enforcers, informants. These men began to take over New York. Manhattan had plenty to offer: brothels, prostitution, illegal gambling, smuggling, all fertile ground for organized crime. Please subscribe and click a like button. Your support really motivates us. And now we continue. You couldn't exactly call them a private military company, but they were essentially paramilitary enforcers, ruthless men who were, in fact, serving the Italian kingdom. The bosses of Cosa Nostra had friendly ties with the Italian aristocracy, and there was nothing particularly shameful about that at the time. At the same time, it's clear that these men were gaining power and started engaging in criminal enterprises in Sicily. What kind of crime are we talking about during that period? First of all, smuggling. Second, emerging corruption, extortion, protection rackets. Though it wasn't even called racketeering back then. These were payments that Cosa Nostra collected in exchange for protection. Protection of businesses, artisans, and local tradespeople. At that point, it was all still very regional and relatively small scale, not serious in terms of financial volume, but the organizational structure was already in place. Cosa Nostra had strict discipline, its own code of laws and rules, a code that continues to function to this very day. That included blood feuds and strict secrecy. You couldn't talk about mafia business with anyone outside the family. Toward the end of the 19th century, Italy's economic situation worsened, and many Italians began emigrating to America. It wasn't just Sicilians. Neapolitans, Calabrians, people from all over Italy who were poor, uncomfortable, or simply seeking new opportunities started arriving in the United States. They settled in New York and began trying to make a living, and they brought with them the values and ways of life they had known in Italy. By the early 20th century, two major Italian criminal groups had formed in New York. One was the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, and the other was Camorra, a mafia group originally from Naples. These two Italian organizations began fighting for control over New York's underworld. But before they could carve up the city's business scene, they first had to confront the existing local enforcers, the Irish gangs. You've probably seen the movie Gangs of New York, which depicts this period quite vividly. Late 19th century, gentlemen with revolvers shooting, killing, and engaging in all sorts of criminal activity. Into this world came the Italians, already equipped with a well-defined criminal hierarchy. Boss, underboss, consigliere, enforcers, informants. These men began to take over New York. Manhattan had plenty to offer: brothels, prostitution, illegal gambling, smuggling, all fertile ground for organized crime. Thanks to their strong internal unity and organizational skills, the Italians quickly pushed out the Irish gangs. What gave the Italians, both Cosa Nostra and Camorra, the two distinct mafias from Sicily and Naples, a significant advantage was their family ties. This wasn't just a random group of guys getting together. These were people from the same clans: brothers, nephews, cousins, often connected by blood, sometimes directly, sometimes through generations, but always part of the same extended family. Naturally, when the police caught one of them, they wouldn't betray their relatives. Interrogations became much more difficult, and it was very hard to convict them in court. Another key difference between the Italians and the Irish was that the first documented mention of the Mafia in America actually occurred in New Orleans, the second major destination for Italian immigrants, alongside New York. In the late 19th century, Police Chief David Hennessy cracked down on some local Italians, and in response, they assassinated him. That incident marked the first time the word mafia appeared in the American press. In the U.S., the term mafia stuck, unlike in Italy, where to this day there are technically four major, organized crime groups, each with its own name: Cosa Nostra, Camorra, Sacra Corona Unita, and 'Ndrangheta, the most brutal of them all. But in America, they're all simply called the Mafia. So, with that murder in New Orleans, the Italians made their first major appearance on the American stage. They weren't afraid to kill police officers, and again, their strong family loyalty made it very hard for law enforcement to break through. By around 1915 to 1917, while the Bolshevik Revolution was happening in Russia, a kind of criminal revolution was taking place in America. The Irish gangs had been pushed out, and two main Italian clans, the Sicilians and the Neapolitans, were now dividing up Manhattan. This wasn't a peaceful negotiation. It involved stabbings, contract killings, revolver shootouts. The war between Camorra and Cosa Nostra lasted a couple of years. Eventually, the Neapolitans were crushed. The final blow came from the New York Police Department itself. One of the arrested Camorra members cracked under pressure and gave up the entire structure. Those who weren't finished off by the Sicilians were rounded up by the police. From that moment, from 1919 onward, the Sicilians, in various forms, would go on to control organized crime in America. Throughout this episode, we'll be jumping back and forth between America and Italy, because the connection between them is inseparable and still exists to this day. One part of the Italian population emigrated and rose to power in America. The other part remained in their homeland. There was constant exchange. Enforcers traveled from Italy to the U.S., and American mobsters would flee back to Europe. This back and forth continued for decades, so we'll keep moving between these two countries. Now, back in New York, the Sicilians had won. Cosa Nostra had prevailed. At the same time, in the 1920s, what was happening in Europe? Italy had become a unified nation, and Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had come to power. Mussolini was extremely popular, riding a wave of support, having consolidated the country. Fascist ideology had triumphed, and he was now the unquestioned leader of the nation. The police, military, and all government institutions followed his orders. But there was one nuance. The Sicilians, according to one version of events, in the early 1920s, Mussolini visited Sicily and expressed concern about his personal security. The local Sicilian boss allegedly said to him condescendingly, "Benito, why would you need bodyguards? You're my guest here, under my protection." Mussolini smiled politely and said, "Of course, that's very kind." But upon returning to Milan, he declared that the Mafia had to be destroyed, because they were assuming powers that belonged to the state. What does it even mean? You're under my protection. Who is he? He's just a criminal. And so Mussolini declared war on the Mafia. Between the early and mid-1920s, Cosa Nostra in Sicily suffered enormous losses. The fascist regime didn't hold back. There were no fair trials with lawyers or appeals. Mafia members were hunted down and arrested. The crackdown was ruthless. Authorities would take family members hostage to force confessions or reveal hideouts, leading to arrests. By the mid-1920s, the Sicilian Mafia had been seriously weakened, and many of its members fled to the United States. For Cosa Nostra, Mussolini became an enemy, one they would later take revenge on. Spoiler alert, they would get their revenge during World War II. But we're not there yet. We're still in the 1920s. So now we move back to the United States. In America, something happened that would define the mafia. Something that made them incredibly rich. The U.S. introduced Prohibition, a law banning the production, sale, and transport of alcohol, lasting roughly from the 1920s to the early 1930s. The goal was noble, to stop people from drinking themselves into ruin. But in reality, and without diving too deep into economic statistics, I'll say this. In New York State, Prohibition was violated 95% of the time. In California, it was ignored 83% of the time. Please subscribe and click a like button. Your support really motivates us. And now we continue. What does all this mean? People kept drinking. If there was no legal alcohol, they bought it at speakeasies, illegal underground bars that flourished during Prohibition. Bootleggers smuggled in Canadian whiskey, grain alcohol, even Russian vodka. Anything that burned. It all came into the United States through back channels, across the Great Lakes, through coastal routes, or overland from Canada. This alcohol flowed into underground casinos, betting parlors, and illegal bars. America kept drinking, and the entire operation was under the control of the Mafia. At this point, some truly legendary figures emerged. Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Meyer Lansky, and, of course, Al Capone. Al Capone, a key figure in the Chicago Syndicate, is probably the most famous gangster of all time, though not necessarily the most powerful, as you'll see later. What made Capone stand out was the media. He had flair. He gave interviews. The press loved him, and he quickly became the darling of the tabloids. After his death, he was immortalized in countless films and TV shows. That iconic image, the man in the fedora, Al Capone, the supposed head of the entire American Mafia. But the truth was more complicated. Capone came up from the streets. He became a major figure within the Chicago Syndicate. Chicago was conveniently close to the Canadian border, just across the lake, and whiskey flowed into the city from Canada like a river. Capone and his men turned this into a massive, well-oiled operation. So what exactly did Capone do differently? How did he modernize the Mafia? He institutionalized corruption. Capone paid off everyone, the police chief, his deputies, prosecutors, judges, lawyers. Everyone had a price, and he made sure they were paid. If you want to watch one of the most accurate films about that era, it's The Untouchables, where Kevin Costner plays the lead role. It tells the story of how a special FBI unit was formed and sent to Chicago. Why were they called the Untouchables? Because the team was recruited from outside Chicago, agents who weren't compromised by the local corruption. Only then were they able to surround and take down Capone. And how did they get him? Not for the contract killings or his criminal empire. Capone was arrested and sent to prison for tax evasion. That's one of the favorite legal stories in American history, because tax evasion carries flexible sentencing, from 5 to 25 years, depending on the amount. So, in the end, Capone went to prison, where he eventually died. But by that time, he had already become a legendary figure in the underworld. And during this same era, the Mafia itself became a massive and extremely wealthy structure. In every major American city, there were several families that controlled all types of criminal enterprises. But bootlegging during Prohibition, that was the Mafia's main source of income. This was an absolutely fantastic source of profit, because people always want to drink. Yesterday they were drinking for 5 rubles, let's say. Today alcohol is banned, so they'll drink for 15. And sure enough, they did, for 15. America kept drinking. At the same time, the Mafia suddenly found itself with a huge amount of free cash, vast sums of untraceable money they needed to invest somewhere. And this is also when the first major internal conflicts began to appear within the American Mafia. New players started to emerge from the Jewish neighborhoods, most notably Meyer Lansky, who I'll return to later in this story, and who, in my opinion, was the most brilliant mobster in America. Then there was Dutch Schultz and Bugsy Siegel. These three men, all from New York's Jewish quarters, though Lansky was actually born in Belarus, brought a completely different vibe, as we'd say today, into the mafia world. They began introducing accounting systems, because it wasn't enough to simply make money or hide it in basements. The money needed to be invested. It needed to be laundered. At this stage, it wasn't yet a major concern, because the American tax system wasn't as advanced as it would become in the 1970s. By tax system, I don't mean the legislation. I mean the actual enforcement, the tax police, the audits, the tracking of criminal financial schemes. Back then, it was all still in its infancy. The Mafia had enormous amounts of black money, and it began to invest it, and this is where the major storyline of early 20th century organized crime begins. The Sicilian clans operated according to the old ways, inherited from their ancestors. You could only work with relatives, and if not relatives, then at least Italians. No Jewish accountants, no Latino enforcers or debt collectors. That was forbidden. You could only work with Italians. Naturally, this mindset began to create stagnation, especially as the Jewish Mafia began to grow rapidly. These were smart guys. They understood taxes. They knew how to handle money. But the old-school Mafia bosses wouldn't let them in. They refused to work with them, refused to bring them into the family. It was absolutely forbidden. No joint operations, no business deals. These old-school leaders, whom the younger mobsters mockingly called the Mustache Petes, started to become a serious problem. They were sitting there, trying to run a modern criminal empire using 19th century methods. But like any other industry, organized crime evolves. Eventually, dissatisfaction began to grow among the younger generation. The leader of this younger faction was Lucky Luciano. Lucky wasn't his real name, it was his nickname. Luciano wasn't yet the boss of the Mafia, but he was a rising star, full of ambition. And he was friends with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mobster he was officially forbidden from doing business with. By that time, the Jewish Mafia had already made a fortune from bootlegging and was rapidly expanding. Naturally, the frustration of the younger generation with the old guard couldn't be resolved peacefully. The Mustache Petes had no intention of giving up their seats of power, so the younger generation had to take them by force. And they did, in blood. In 1929, a major conflict broke out, what became known as the Castellamarese War. It was a brutal struggle between two powerful Sicilian families, the family of Joe Masseria and that of Salvatore Maranzano. Two Mustache Petes, two old-school Mafia bosses who were fighting for control, not just of Manhattan, but of all of America. By then, the Mafia had grown so powerful that nearly every major U.S. city had multiple families profiting from bootlegging. The Prohibition era had brought in enormous wealth, but in 1930, Prohibition was repealed. That cash stream began to dry up and eventually disappeared altogether. So the Mafia needed to redivide the territory. What followed was a wave of contract killings, betrayal, switching of sides, mass shootings with Tommy guns, car bombings, a full-on war that lasted 2 years. By 1931, the war ended. Joe Masseria was assassinated, and Salvatore Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He imposed a strict hierarchy, a pivotal moment in Mafia history. The title Boss of Bosses meant exactly what it sounds like. The man who ruled over the entire Italian-American Mafia structure. A rigid organization was established. Each city could have only one dominant mafia family, and all others would answer to it. That main family would report to New York, and in New York, due to its size and wealth, 5 families were allowed instead of 1. But all 5 were subordinate to the capo di tutti capi. He made all the big decisions: who should be killed, who should be promoted, who gets shot, where money should be invested, which cop to bribe or eliminate, where to funnel cash, where to pull out. It all went through him, and that's how the Mafia became the structure we recognize today. A rigid, organized crime syndicate. Every family had a boss, a consigliere, an advisor, an underboss, deputy, a mafia accountant, capos, crew leaders, and soldiers, the men on the street, doing the dirty work. This structure was mirrored in every city. It created a highly centralized and disciplined hierarchy, a structure that, remarkably, still exists today. It allowed the Mafia to stay mobile, highly organized, and continuously grow its wealth and influence. Maranzano was the first boss of the entire American Mafia, but his reign was short-lived because the conflict I started talking about had already reached a dead end. All the young Italian guys no longer wanted to make peace with the old men. They understood that the business was changing, that it was necessary to work with competing groups, with the Jewish Mafia, to invest money. There was some movement happening in Cuba, and here the casinos were starting. But the old guys firmly said that maybe casinos were wrong, and then drugs appeared, and they believed drugs shouldn't be dealt at all. But in reality, you had to deal with everything: control prostitution, control illegal bookmakers. This conflict between the young and the old ended with the associates of Salvatore Maranzano, the first American Mafia boss, his associates being Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel, along with Meyer Lansky, organizing a contract killing. Maranzano was gunned down. Then enters the legendary mafioso. As I said, the most publicized don was Capone, but he was never the biggest or most influential. That title belonged to Lucky Luciano, who became the boss of all bosses after Maranzano's death. He was truly a legendary figure. Lucky Luciano established a rigid vertical structure, becoming the boss of bosses, and one of his first decisions was to work with the Jewish Mafia. Luciano organized a structure known as the Big Seven, though that name was given by journalists, and I doubt they called themselves that internally, although maybe they did. It included 5 New York families, 5 New York clans, and 2 individuals: Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. You'll keep hearing Lansky's name. He was the smartest man in the American criminal world. This Big Seven, 5 Sicilian families plus 2 Jewish crime businessmen, started doing serious business in America. They took control of prostitution, took control of illegal gambling houses, and the Mafia began investing money in opening their own casinos. That's when the first laundries appeared. When we say money laundering, they laundered the money. What does that mean? In reality, laundering money is a fairly simple thing. You have a lot of dirty income collected from the streets, from all the illegal deals, but you need to buy houses, cars. You need to have some kind of legitimate business. You can't just pour dirty money into legitimate businesses because U.S. tax laws are quite strict, so the money needs to be laundered. How do you launder money? Money is laundered only in places with high foot traffic. Where is there high foot traffic? In restaurants, bars, and laundromats. People come in, pay in cash, and no one really knows how much money you actually made. For example, how much does it cost to wash a shirt? 100 or 500? Who's to say? The scheme worked very simply. You own a chain of bars, a chain of pizzerias, a chain of laundromats, and you declare huge revenue, claiming there's a massive flow of customers, when in reality, there aren't that many. You funnel all your dirty money through these businesses, as if it came from regular customers, and you declare it as your legitimate income. Now you've got clean money. This scheme was invented by Meyer Lansky, and to this day, variations of this system still operate around the world. When we use the term mafia laundry, that's exactly how it works. The first laundering fronts really were laundromats. The second structure, created by Lucky Luciano, was a murder corporation. Murder, Inc., as New York journalists called it. It was headed by Albert Anastasia. These were the guys who carried out contract killings. The mafia began to function more like an industry. It was no longer like in the 19th century where, if someone needed to be killed, like some guy named Paul, people would say, "Let's get Bert, he's a good shot." No, now there was an entire organization, a department, that specialized in contract killings. They meticulously planned everything. They chose escape routes, they created alibis in case they were caught by the police, and so on. Contract killings became streamlined like any other job. One guy was in charge of prostitution, another of illegal betting, another ran the underground gambling dens, and someone else handled the murders. Lucky Luciano industrialized the mafia. He transformed the Sicilian-style mafia into a rigid corporate structure within the American mafia. By 1935, the American mafia had a strict hierarchy. At the top was Lucky Luciano, the boss of bosses. Vito Genovese was his underboss, his second in command. And Frank Costello served as the consigliere, the advisor. This triumvirate effectively functioned as the top management of the American mafia. As I already mentioned, Lucky Luciano was building an entirely corporate structure. He was, in fact, an effective manager. Any sectors of his operations that weren't efficient were quickly turned into Swiss cheese by Tommy guns. So everything under his control functioned very smoothly. It all came to an end in 1936, when Luciano was arrested by the police and sent to prison. His deputy, Vito Genovese, became the head of the mafia, but he only held that position for a year. In 1937, facing charges of contract murder, Genovese fled to Italy to avoid prison time. As a result, Frank Costello became the new mafia boss. He would go on to lead the American mafia until the 1950s and would be associated with many bizarre and anecdotal stories. It was under Frank Costello that a ban was introduced, especially frustrating for many mafiosi in the 60s and 70s, against drug trafficking. Costello believed that drug dealing was immoral, ungodly work. He strictly forbade it, and harshly punished any mafiosi caught participating in the narcotics trade. In 1933, 3 years before Costello became the head of the mafia, another major event took place. Meyer Lansky, who we haven't forgotten for a single moment in this story, started building the first casinos in America. His first casino was in New Orleans, the second somewhere else, I don't quite recall, but the exact location isn't important. The key point is that Meyer Lansky moved into Cuba. Cuba at the time was like an all-American brothel, cheap, with beautiful women, fantastic weather year-round, and constant fun. It was the ultimate American playground, filled with hotels and resorts. Lansky began opening casinos there. The first one he launched was called Nacional, and it started generating incredible profits. Eventually, Lansky created a thoroughly corrupt system. Every Cuban official was on his payroll. Cuban President Fulgencio Batista not only received a salary from Lansky, but also held a share in the Nacional Casino. And how did Batista even become president? By accepting a $250,000 bribe to extend his term in office. This was a perfect example of mafia and government becoming one. And on Cuba, this fusion was in full force. By that point, Cuba essentially belonged to the Italian and American mafia. Meyer Lansky became the man who funneled American mafia money into the gambling business. In 1939, World War II broke out, and as you know, after Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. While the fighting didn't take place on American soil, the entire American society became deeply involved in the war effort. In New York, German spies and saboteurs began operating, trying to disrupt arms shipments to the front and sabotage merchant convoys. What is a port? A port belongs to the mafia, of course, because it's a source of everything: smuggling, illegal human trafficking, covert departures. Naturally, it was under mafia control. And that's exactly where German agents started appearing. At this point, the first significant contact between the U.S. government and the mafia occurred. The government reached out to Meyer Lansky, asking for help in protecting the port of New York from sabotage. Why Lansky? It's simple. Meyer Lansky was Jewish and a fierce anti-fascist. When semi-fascist organizations began forming in the U.S., he personally disrupted their meetings, beat up their members, not for money, but because he genuinely hated fascism. During the war, he would go on to help Jewish refugees extensively, paying $500 for each Jew that needed to be housed in Manhattan. This would later come back as a favor repaid in full. So the CIA contacted Lansky and said, "Mr. Lansky, we have a problem." And Lansky replied, "There's no problem at all. We'll take care of everything. And I know just the man. You know him too, Lucky Luciano. He's been in prison for 15 years. We'll take care of these saboteurs, cut their ears off if we have to." And indeed, peace and order were restored in the port of New York. 5 saboteurs were caught almost immediately and handed over to the authorities. Eventually, a legal deal was made, and Lucky Luciano was released from prison. During the war, he was sent to Italy, part of the agreement being that he had to leave the U.S., either to Mexico, Argentina, or Italy. He chose Italy, the homeland of his parents. The second major moment came with the famous Allied landing operation in Sicily toward the end of World War II. Why Sicily? Sure, it was strategically convenient, the tip of the Italian boot. But that wasn't the main reason. The key factor was this: Mussolini had brutally crushed the mafia in the 1920s, and the mob never forgave him for that. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, those were the guys who opened the gates to Italy. They revealed the best locations for amphibious landings, suggested supply routes, pointed out the safe harbors. It was all coordinated by Lucky Luciano, who, like the Cosa Nostra, despised Benito Mussolini. So this marked the second time the mafia significantly helped the U.S. government. Here we need to make a small digression, because at that moment, 2 key figures were in exile: Lucky Luciano and his former deputy, Vito Genovese. Now, Vito Genovese was also a Sicilian, and unlike Luciano, he ended up collaborating with Mussolini. Mussolini gave him a welcome gift of $200,000 and helped him set up various businesses, including illegal pharmaceutical supplies and other shady operations. So, while one mafia figure was working against Mussolini, the other was working with him. This clearly shows that when people say mafiosi have honor, conscience, or that they never break their criminal word, it's complete nonsense. Wherever there's profit, that's where loyalty lies. So while Lucky Luciano was helping the Americans land in Sicily, Vito Genovese was helping Mussolini make money. Then comes a very interesting twist. The war ends. Mussolini is hanged upside down, and trials begin. Genovese is set to be prosecuted, not as a mafioso, but as a fascist collaborator and war criminal. The historical record is vague about how exactly he manages to weasel out of it. But just a year after the war ends, in 1946, Vito Genovese is already illegally selling ammunition, food supplies, medicine, and decommissioned vehicles from American Army stockpiles. What's more, he has a letter from a U.S. quartermaster and even a letter from the Italian consul in New York, confirming he is assisting with this activity. Yesterday he was profiting with Mussolini. Today he's profiting with Mussolini's enemies. What about the second exile? Lucky Luciano. You've probably heard the term French Connection. What was the French Connection? It was a heroin trafficking network into the United States, created by none other than Lucky Luciano. From his exile in Italy, with little else to do, he devised a cunning plan with some influential partners. It starts with opium, the same opium known from the Opium Wars, sourced from Southeast Asia and Turkey. Opium was needed for the pharmaceutical industry. Most of the labs processing opium for legal pharma use at the time were located in the port city of Marseille. These labs received raw opium, refined it, and turned it into medication. But around 20% of the incoming opium was immediately siphoned off, repackaged, and smuggled to New York via a direct pipeline involving Corsican mobsters. The rest was distributed across Europe. This entire trafficking network, built by Luciano, is widely believed to be the origin of what came to be known as the French Connection. Although some historians have disputed Luciano's central role, many consider it a fact. He was the architect behind the French Connection. Heroin exports from Southeast Asia and Turkey, funneled through Marseille to the United States, operated from the 1930s to the 1970s. For 40 years, people made unimaginable profits, and this marked the beginning of the Mafia's first wave of globalization. On one side was the American syndicate, which received the drugs. On the other side, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, which orchestrated the entire operation. And in the middle were the Corsican gangsters, based in Marseille, who controlled the local trafficking networks. This was the perfect alliance, and it worked like a well-oiled machine. The war ended. It was 1946, and we returned to the United States. The Mafia discovered its next gold mine after Prohibition, the casino business, and this story is closely tied to Meyer Lansky's friend and another legendary mafioso, Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel came from a Jewish family. He earned his first money working as a bouncer and participating in contract killings. He later got extremely rich during Prohibition. In 1937, he was sent to California to oversee illegal bookmakers, those handling bets on horse races. These operations brought in enormous profits, and Siegel managed them very effectively. Since all betting odds and race results were transmitted via telegraph, he helped push one telegraph company out in favor of another, one that the Mafia controlled. Meanwhile, Hollywood was booming, and a famous love affair began between American gangsters and Hollywood starlets. Bugsy Siegel was the first to jump into that world. He was absolutely fascinated by cinema, loved attending premieres, and had countless lovers. One of them was Virginia Hill, an American actress. In her honor, the first casino in Las Vegas would be named Flamingo. After running the bookmaking business, according to legend, Bugsy Siegel passed through Las Vegas and thought, why not build an American Monte Carlo here? He approached his friend, Meyer Lansky, by then effectively the chief accountant of the entire American Mafia, and said, Meyer, you're making great money with the El Nacional Casino in Havana. Why don't we build something like that in America? Lansky negotiated with the Italians. Siegel was given the money, and in 1945 the first Vegas casino, the Flamingo, named after Virginia Hill's nickname, opened its doors. However, the opening was delayed, and initially the casino didn't generate the expected profits. Worse, rumors started circulating among mobsters that Siegel had been embezzling heavily during construction. He had been awarding shady contracts to his relatives and essentially stealing from the Mafia. And in 1946, a legendary meeting of American mobsters took place in Havana. Luciano was there, Meyer Lansky was there, and, famously, Frank Sinatra showed up as well. This event would go on to haunt the greatest American singer for the rest of his life. Sinatra visited Havana a couple of times and was photographed with nearly every major mafia boss. When questioned, he simply said, "What can I do? They invite me to private parties. They're my friends. Should I refuse?" At one point, according to some accounts, he was nearly caught carrying a suitcase full of cash, millions of dollars, from New York to California. He even had his own casino, which, it later turned out, was backed by the Gambino crime family. So yes, Sinatra was definitely entangled with the American Mafia. But, as they say, we love him not for that. At that 1946 Havana meeting, the Mafia issued what was effectively a death sentence for Bugsy Siegel. He had been stealing money from his own people, and in the Mafia, that's an unforgivable crime. However, Meyer Lansky, his close friend, stepped in to defend him. Lansky pleaded, "Listen, Bugsy is my friend. Yes, he skimmed some money, but give him a year. The casino will soon turn a profit. He'll return everything. Killing him now, halfway through, is just not right." The Mafia agreed, temporarily. Siegel was granted a one-year reprieve. But a year later, just as the Flamingo Casino finally began to generate massive profits, Bugsy Siegel was shot dead on the veranda of his own home. All of his casino assets were immediately seized and transferred to the American Mafia. The Mafia's role in the rise of Las Vegas was nothing short of monumental. They invested in the first major casino and started earning enormous profits. This marked a new golden era for the Mafia after the end of Prohibition. They now controlled the entire gambling industry in America, on one side in Las Vegas, and on the other side, as previously mentioned, in Cuba. By the 1950s, the American Mafia was at its peak. Frank Costello, whom we've already discussed, was the uncontested leader. Lucky Luciano was still in exile in Italy, as was Vito Genovese for the time being, and Costello ruled the American Mafia with absolute authority. Costello's downfall, however, would come from two infamous incidents. Some might call them amusing, others pivotal. You've probably seen the film Analyze This, where a mob boss starts visiting a therapist, or the TV show The Sopranos. Well, all of that traces back to Frank Costello. The story of The Sopranos, where the head of a mafia clan visits a therapist, actually mirrors the real-life story of Frank Costello. In the 1950s, at the peak of his power, Costello began experiencing panic attacks, stress, and episodes of fainting. So he started seeing a psychiatrist. But at some point, the psychiatrist let it slip to a journalist friend. "You know who's coming to see me? Frank Costello, the boss of all bosses." That information immediately hit the press. Costello cut ties with the therapist, though, surprisingly, the therapist wasn't killed, which is remarkable given the circumstances. Still, rumors began swirling within the Mafia. The boss had gone mad. After all, how could a real Italian man go to a shrink? Was he a Hollywood actor? A woman? How could that be possible? People began mocking him, and it started damaging his reputation. At the same time, Vito Genovese returned from Italy. He had been the boss before his exile, and now he wanted his throne back. But Costello wasn't about to give it up. So Genovese began plotting against him. Meanwhile, Costello essentially committed political suicide. The 1950s weren't just the golden age of the Mafia. They were also a time of massive economic growth, and the explosive rise of American television. And TV thrived on one thing: show business. By this point, rumors about the Mafia controlling everything had moved beyond tabloid headlines. They had reached the United States Senate. Senators and congressmen launched a formal investigation into organized crime. The FBI arrested dozens of mafiosi. Some gave testimony, others refused. These proceedings became known as the Kefauver hearings, named after Senator Estes Kefauver, who spearheaded the investigation, and for the first time, the spectacle of the Mafia was brought directly into people's living rooms. Every day, Americans tuned in to watch drug dealers, pimps, and low-level Mafia lieutenants testify in court. These men started naming higher-ups. Those higher-ups, of course, all had lawyers. And the lawyers told them, "Don't go to the hearings. Invoke the Fifth Amendment. You're not obligated to testify against yourself, especially if you haven't been formally charged." But Frank Costello didn't listen to his lawyers. Astoundingly, he couldn't resist the spotlight. He loved show business, fancy suits, front-page headlines, media attention, so he showed up at the hearings, hoping to prove that he wasn't the boss of bosses, but just an honest businessman. What followed was a public disaster. He dodged questions, repeatedly claimed he couldn't remember, and, most importantly, the entire thing was broadcast live on national television. It became a national joke. Just imagine it. Serious men sitting around, shaking their heads. Our guy's really lost it. First, he starts seeing a shrink, and then he goes on live television arguing with judges and lawyers. It's humiliating. Real men don't show up on TV or radio. That's just not how we do things. That's not how this life works. For Frank Costello, it all ended in disgrace. At that moment, Vito Genovese returned from Italy and immediately began scheming. Naturally, parts of the American Mafia, especially the old-school Italian factions, started rallying around him. Genovese promised them, "Under me, things will go back to how they were under Lucky Luciano. I'm not a fool. I don't go to psychiatrists or talk on national television. Come on, are you insane?" Eventually, Genovese organized an assassination attempt on Costello. Costello survived only because, at the moment the trigger was pulled, he turned his head toward the shooter, and the bullet grazed his chin instead of hitting him in the head. After surviving the hit, Costello stepped down from power. Vito Genovese then assumed full control. He became the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, the undisputed ruler of the American Mafia. But by then, the Mafia had already fractured into segments. In New York, there were 5 families, 5 powerful clans, each managing its own territory. California had a different structure. Chicago was its own empire. There were also strongholds in Philadelphia and Boston. Even in Canada, Mafia-linked businessmen were starting to take control of local ports. The old rigid hierarchy that had existed under Lucky Luciano was long gone. Genovese, driven by pride and ambition, vanity would become a constant theme in Mafia culture, wanted to restore that centralized power. The obsession with sharp suits, luxury cars, and posing for paparazzi, this flamboyant, showy lifestyle, would continue to define the Italian-American Mafia to this day. Determined to officially declare himself boss of bosses, Vito Genovese called for a massive meeting of all family heads. He invited everyone to a rural estate for what would become known as the Appalachian Conference, held in 1957. His goal was to have every family formally recognize his leadership. He planned to outline his grand vision and seal his coronation with a symbolic show of unity. But it ended in a complete disaster. A local police officer in Appalachian, New York, noticed something odd: an unusual number of luxury cars with license plates from New York, Chicago, and California were rolling into town. Every motel and hotel nearby was suddenly booked for the weekend. Strong, well-dressed men were arriving in droves. Suspicious, the officer filed a report with his superior, who quickly contacted the FBI. When all the mafia families gathered for the meeting, law enforcement moved in. Federal agents and special units surrounded the area, and the entire Appalachian Conference ended in total disaster for Vito Genovese. Many mafiosi were arrested trying to flee through the woods in expensive suits and shoes. The event exposed the mafia's structure to the public in an unprecedented way, and Genovese's plan to be crowned boss of bosses collapsed. Eventually, he was arrested and sent to prison. And with that, a new chapter began in America. The Gambino family rose to power and would dominate the American mafia until the early 1980s, periodically clashing with other families but maintaining a strong grip on organized crime. We'll return to the Gambinos later. For now, let's jump back to Italy. In the 1960s, the French Connection, the heroin trafficking network we talked about earlier, was still in full swing. Sicilian clans were deeply involved, and the enormous sums of money it generated eventually caused internal conflict. This led to what became known as the First Mafia War in Palermo, a brutal conflict between rival Sicilian clans. It was an incredibly violent war, involving kidnappings, car bombings, and entire families being wiped out. Over the course of 2 years, around 500 people were killed on both sides. When the Italian police finally intervened, mass arrests followed. More than 1,500 people were detained across Sicily. While most of those arrested were low-level soldiers and mid-level captains, and high-ranking bosses largely escaped prosecution, the scale of the violence was unprecedented. This war was the first serious intra-mafia power struggle, an effort to consolidate control within the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. Despite the bloodshed, the Sicilian mafia emerged even stronger. Thanks to heroin trafficking, they solidified their role as a major global criminal force. For years after that, right up until the early 1980s, Cosa Nostra continued to dominate the heroin trade from Marseille to New York and across Europe. Meanwhile, in America, a completely different story was unfolding. In the 1970s, cocaine arrived in the U.S. Until then, cocaine had only appeared sporadically, mostly as a bohemian luxury drug in the 1920s, but it had faded into obscurity. That changed in the 70s with the rise of the Colombian cartels. A full-blown cocaine boom began, and a new era of drug trafficking was launched, one that would eventually reshape organized crime on both sides of the Atlantic. This was the explosion of nightlife culture, and naturally, the American mafia wasn't going to miss out. The Gambino family began getting involved in the cocaine trade, and this marked the second major wave of mafia globalization. The first wave had been through the heroin business, and now came the cocaine era. Colombian cartels, located far from the U.S., were producing massive quantities of cocaine. But to get it into America, they needed infrastructure, logistics, smuggling routes, corrupt officials. They had to bribe the U.S. Coast Guard, law enforcement, and then, once the drugs hit the streets, they needed people to collect the money. That's where local black street gangs stepped in to handle street-level distribution. And then, of course, the money had to be laundered, moved through shell companies, washed clean, and deposited into accounts around the world. This is when the American mafia truly became a transnational corporation. They had drug pipelines from Colombia, relatives in Sicily and across Italy, and then Switzerland entered the picture. Meyer Lansky, still active behind the scenes, was the mastermind who pioneered the use of Swiss bank accounts for laundering mafia money. He was among the first to open anonymous accounts for the American mafia, accounts registered to fake names, offshore shell companies, and nominee directors. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, several Swiss banks came under international sanctions, precisely because they had helped launder hundreds of millions of dollars from the American and Colombian underworld. Alongside banks in Luxembourg, Swiss bankers made a fortune from this illegal activity. And the man behind the idea? Meyer Lansky. Meanwhile, as the Colombian cartels rose to power, the American underworld started to face serious competition. The Colombians began partnering with Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and other Latin gangs. On the streets, black organized crime groups grew stronger. In the 1980s, and especially the 1990s, they would become a real force. For now, they were still under the Mafia's shadow, but the power balance was beginning to shift. The Gambino era, which began in the 1960s, would come to an end around the late 80s to early 90s. The family would face the same crisis the Sicilian Mafia had faced back in the 1920s. Their old-school methods of leadership no longer worked. The conservative, hierarchical mafia model was becoming obsolete. Meanwhile, Colombian cartels, once dismissed by the Italians as peasant drug farmers, had evolved into massive global operations. In the 1960s, they were laughed off. By the 1980s, they were outcompeting the Mafia in money, muscle, and reach. The rules of the underworld were changing, and the Italians were no longer the only power on the board. Everything changed when the Colombians started making far more money, and that, in turn, began to reform the Mafia itself. The biggest shift came from the emergence of international financial transactions. Once Mafia money started flowing out of the United States and circulating globally, the entire structure had to evolve. The first major laundering hub was Panama, followed by Switzerland and Luxembourg. Then came the Bermuda, and all the other offshore havens you've probably heard of. Meyer Lansky was the mastermind behind this architecture, a Jewish crime figure with an extraordinary mind. He was the one who gave the Mafia the financial infrastructure it needed to become a truly international criminal empire. An infrastructure that, in many ways, still exists today. Let's take a closer look at Meyer Lansky. His real surname was Sukhomlinsky, and he was born in Belarus, though he often claimed to be from Poland. He grew up on the streets of New York, where he eventually met Lucky Luciano. Their friendship started under rough conditions. As teenagers hustling on the streets, Lansky was running small-time rackets when Luciano approached him and said, "Listen, Jew, you owe me $10 a week." Lansky replied, "Are you crazy?" Luciano made anti-Semitic remarks, then beat Lansky up with his crew and took his money. But a week later, Lansky ambushed Luciano, smashed him over the head with a rock, robbed him clean, and said, "If you ever call me a kike again, I'll cut your tongue out. You think you Italians are the only ones who know how to use knives?" From that moment on, they became lifelong friends and business partners. Luciano provided the muscle. Lansky handled the brains and the money. Lansky played a crucial role in organizing the bootlegging business during Prohibition. By 1937, as previously mentioned, he expanded operations to Cuba, where he opened the first casinos. Thanks to Lansky, the entire Cuban gambling industry came under Mafia control. Even Batista's rise to power, the Cuban dictator, was orchestrated by Lansky, with a $250,000 bribe to secure the presidency. Lansky wasn't just a criminal. He was the architect of Mafia capitalism, building systems of money laundering, offshore banking, and global finance that turned a street-level organization into a criminal empire with diplomatic reach and corporate efficiency. Meyer Lansky also played a key role in Las Vegas. It was he whom Bugsy Siegel approached for funding to launch the first casinos in the desert. Lansky, the financial brain of the American Mafia, approved the plan and backed it. There's also a rather surreal episode from 1959 when Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba and seized all Mafia property and assets. The only person who had the audacity to personally confront Castro and Che Guevara was none other than Meyer Lansky, this Jewish man in a suit, tie, and fedora. He showed up and told them, "You took everything from the Brotherhood. That's very wrong. We might have to start shooting at you." The meeting was intense, and most thought Lansky was insane for even going there. He left Cuba alive, but the revolutionaries confiscated everything. Years later, after Castro's death, Lansky's son filed a claim to reclaim compensation for the confiscated El Nacional casino. The legal process is still ongoing, and Cuba has never returned the money. Another pivotal role Lansky played was in assisting the U.S. government during World War II. He helped protect the New York harbor from German saboteurs and facilitated the Allied landing in Sicily by connecting the military with Sicilian mafia contacts. The third major episode in Lansky's life was his support for Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. He personally donated large sums to help relocate Jews fleeing Nazi Germany to New York. This act of philanthropy would prove invaluable later. In 1970, Lansky was formally indicted for the first time for connections to organized crime, tax evasion, illegal gambling operations, and even contract killings. But it turned out he had a long-term Israeli visa, and he fled to Israel. When U.S. authorities tried to extradite him, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir reportedly told FBI representatives, "Wait, Meyer Lansky? A mobster? No, we don't know anyone like that. Meyer Lansky is a philanthropist. He's always helped the Jewish people. He wears a kippah, goes to synagogue, and donated weapons during the Arab invasion. No, he's our friend. We will not hand him over." So for 2 years, Lansky lived freely in Israel. Just think about the level of protection and influence he had. And the truth is, Lansky was indeed a religious man. His fascination with casinos, ironically, was tied to his faith. As a child, he once lost the money his mother gave him to buy challah. He gambled it away. From that moment, he swore never to gamble again. But he realized just how profitable it was when others lost, and that's when he decided to invest in the gambling industry instead of playing. After 2 years in Israel, Lansky was eventually extradited to the U.S., where he faced a 6-year legal battle. In the end, he was acquitted. It's one of the most remarkable stories in organized crime history. The man who managed all the mafia's money, who built its entire financial structure, walked free. In 1976, Meyer Lansky was officially acquitted of all charges. He went on to live a long life, dying at the age of 81. It was believed that he had amassed a fortune of over $300 million hidden in offshore accounts and registered under fake names and shell companies. However, after his death, only $57,000 was found in his personal accounts. Publicly, he lived like a modest retiree, though, according to rumors, he stayed in luxury properties, including a penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria. Despite the whispers, Lansky was a man of routine. He walked everywhere, walked his dog, and never flaunted his wealth like the flashy Italian mobsters. After his death, all that was officially found was $57,000. And yet, Meyer Lansky is remembered as the smartest man in organized crime, the visionary businessman who transformed the mafia into the structured empire we recognize today. But the story of the American mafia wouldn't be complete without talking about its deep ties to the labor union movement. In every mafia series or film, there's always a moment involving a builders' union, truckers' union, or some other blue-collar organization. There's a common perception that unions were helpless victims crushed under mafia control, that the mob simply extorted workers and siphoned off funds. That's only partly true. In reality, the union movement in America, a powerful, widespread force, and the mafia were mutually dependent. So how did this collaboration work? Unions had one major asset: people. Let's take, for example, the truckers' union. Their power lay in their ability to organize nationwide strikes. If corporations underpaid drivers, the union could bring commerce to a halt. To counter this, corporations often hired strikebreakers, non-union drivers willing to keep working during strikes. Unions would try to persuade these strikebreakers, "Come on, Vasya, we're all on strike. Why are you driving? Join us." But not everyone could be convinced. Some had already taken corporate money. So the union would turn to the mafia and say, "Look, Vasya took a job during a strike. Can someone slash his tires? Or maybe give him a little beating with baseball bats?" To which the Italians replied, "Of course we can." This was the dark but functional symbiosis between labor unions and the mafia. Unions had people. The mafia had muscle. Together, they shaped American labor politics and shook the corporate world well into the late 20th century. In return for their help, the mafia often asked for seemingly minor favors. For example, "Hey, there's a shipping contract coming up. Could you make sure it goes to our guy in Oklahoma? Remember, we helped you out back then." And that's how it worked. A system of informal exchanges kept alive through mutual benefit and quiet coercion. Then there were union dues, huge sums of money collected from thousands of members. These funds were controlled by union leaders who often invested them into mafia-connected ventures or semi-legal schemes, generating massive profits. In return, the mafia helped these union bosses rise in power, sometimes transforming them into political figures. They would merge multiple labor sectors under one umbrella: truckers with logistics workers, aviation services with railway workers, and so on. These super unions became powerful conglomerates, and with that power came corruption. Yes, the workers often suffered, their interests sidelined, but the mafia and union bosses flourished, working hand in hand. Sometimes things fell apart, especially when union leaders began to feel too powerful, thinking they no longer needed the mafia. That's when those leaders were assassinated. But for the most part, from the 1950s to the present day, the American mafia and labor unions have continued this mutually profitable relationship. Meanwhile, in Italy, the mafia reached its peak in the 1980s, a period of unprecedented power. Practically every major institution was corrupted. Oil giants like Eni, national rail corporations, even ministers, police, and prosecutors were on mafia payrolls. Italian criminal syndicates operated with total impunity, forming international alliances and expanding their influence beyond Sicily. The 1970s and 80s were the golden age of Italian organized crime. But such unchecked power inevitably led to a violent backlash. In the 1970s, Sicily was once again plunged into bloodshed. The so-called Great Mafia War broke out, initiated by the brutal Corleonese clan from the town of Corleone. They launched a war to seize total control of Cosa Nostra, targeting rival families. It was an extremely violent conflict. Mass shootings, assassinations, kidnappings, including children taken as hostages. During this chaos, a splinter group emerged from Cosa Nostra, Stida, a rival organization composed of ex-mafia members and rebels who opposed the Corleonese's reign of terror. This marked a new chapter in the fragmentation and militarization of organized crime in Italy. The Stida, whose members were often marked by a star-shaped tattoo, emerged as a younger, rebellious offshoot of Cosa Nostra. They wanted their own cut of the profits and joined the brutal Mafia War as junior partners. The conflict raged for 10 years, marked by street executions, car bombings, and the deaths of countless civilians. The violence became so extreme that it shocked the entire Italian public. As a result, Italy deployed prosecutors en masse to Sicily. But the Mafia had grown so powerful that it responded by assassinating prosecutors. When the police cracked down harder, the Mafia escalated. Prosecutors were blown up, and the government had to send in not just carabinieri, but actual military units, armed formations of the Italian army. The Corleonesi clan, undeterred, even carried out a train bombing on the Naples-Rome line, initially blaming it on left-wing extremist groups. It wasn't until the 1990s that investigators uncovered the truth. The type of explosive used was of American origin and had been delivered by a Gambino associate who had flown in from New York to Sicily. He not only brought the explosives, but taught the Corleonesi how to use them. The transatlantic mafia ties were still very much alive. Things spiraled into total lawlessness. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra felt so invincible that it eliminated anyone it couldn't bribe. Judges, prosecutors, even a brigadier general sent to oversee anti-mafia operations were gunned down along with his wife. The mafia's grip on Italy was suffocating, but in the early 1990s, Italian society had had enough. Public outrage exploded after a wave of assassinations, particularly the killings of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two high-profile anti-mafia magistrates. These murders catalyzed a national turning point. In Milan, a prosecutor named Antonio Di Pietro launched Operation Clean Hands, Mani Pulite. It became the largest anti-corruption campaign in modern European history. Over the course of a decade, the operation led to the prosecution of around 2,500 people: businessmen, politicians, local officials, police officers, judges, prosecutors, all of whom had been corrupted by mafia influence to varying degrees. To give a sense of scale, it started with the uncovering of a fraudulent tender for building a nursing home in Milan. That led to the discovery that public funds were being funneled into mafia-controlled companies. From there, the investigation unraveled an entire web of systemic corruption across Italy. The mafia handed out construction contracts, waste removal tenders, infrastructure deals. They were involved in everything. Clean Hands exposed just how deeply embedded organized crime was in the very fabric of the Italian state. To be clear, the Italian political system was completely reshaped as a result of the Clean Hands, Mani Pulite campaign. 4 major political parties, from the Socialists to the Christian Democrats, ceased to exist entirely because their leaders were deeply entangled in corruption deals with the mafia. During this period, even journalists and heads of television networks were arrested. Italy was thoroughly infiltrated by mafia connections. And it wasn't just mafiosi who were imprisoned. Virtually everyone linked to them in any capacity was also taken down. This all led to a political reset, during which a new party emerged, Forza Italia, led by Silvio Berlusconi. He entered politics, and critics claimed that his real motive was to protect himself from prosecution by the Milan prosecutor's office. His brother Antonio was already in prison at the time after being implicated in money transfers tied to construction contracts, shady advertising deals, and energy mergers, all of which involved Berlusconi's business empire. His takeover of Italian media was also allegedly facilitated by gray, borderline legal financial schemes. When Berlusconi reached the peak of political power, he publicly praised prosecutor Antonio Di Pietro, saying, "He's a good guy. Look, he even arrested my brother. Illegally, of course, but everyone else he got. Totally fair." He claimed to support clean hands, insisting that Italy needed to be freed from corruption. But once Berlusconi became prime minister, the first thing he did was declare war on Antonio Di Pietro. The attacks were relentless. They found Di Pietro's lover, accused him of taking a free meal at a restaurant. Anything that could be twisted into a corruption allegation. The battle was fierce, and ultimately, Berlusconi managed to bring down Di Pietro, effectively dismantling the Clean Hands campaign. Yes, it's true. A massive number of officials, bankers, financiers, and mafiosi were imprisoned. Some of them were later released under Berlusconi's government. Still, the campaign delivered a serious blow to the mafia. To this day, Clean Hands is considered a model operation, showing how a united state can stand up to organized crime. That said, Clean Hands didn't emerge out of nowhere. While it began and ended in the 1990s, the Americans had already started hitting the mafia on a global scale back in the 1970s. This ties directly to New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who was Italian-American himself. He made it his personal mission to prove that not all Italians are mobsters. "I'm the mayor of New York," he said. "I'll show you that the mafia can be dismantled." And he meant it. Together with the FBI, Giuliani launched a fierce, relentless war against the American mafia. If you watch Netflix documentaries, you'll see how the FBI wiretapped mafia members, leading to the arrest and prosecution of key figures from the Gambino, Bonanno, and Genovese families. Many ended up in court because of those secret recordings. But all of this became possible thanks to the passage of a groundbreaking law. The RICO Act, short for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It still exists today. Under RICO, prosecutors can link a single criminal act to an entire criminal enterprise. Before RICO, the law could only charge individuals for specific crimes. Say, a hitman caught shooting someone might get 10 years in prison, and that was it. But with RICO, authorities could prove that the hitman was acting on orders, and then build a web of evidence connecting him all the way up to the mafia boss, even through distant intermediaries. The entire organization could be prosecuted as a coordinated criminal enterprise. That's how Giuliani and the FBI began dismantling the mafia. At the time, the most flamboyant and powerful mob boss was John Gotti, head of the Gambino family. Gotti was infamous for his flashy suits, his charisma, and his love for the spotlight. He gave interviews, insisting that people were always trying to tarnish his good name. One of his most iconic lines was, "I don't want much out of life, just a good tuna sandwich." But wiretaps caught his real voice, on tape, openly confessing his identity. "I am Cosa Nostra, and always will be. I don't know if I'll die tomorrow or in 100 years, but I'll always live by the code. Bring me that guy. If you don't, just tell him I'll kill him for being disrespectful." That evidence was enough to put Gotti in prison for good. Even behind bars, Gotti remained defiant. He got into a fight with a fellow inmate. Yes, the boss of bosses got his head bashed in by a cellmate. In response, he sent a message through his lawyer. "Tell my people I'm offering $500,000 to anyone who cuts this guy's ears off." His logic: "I'm already in prison. What difference does it make now?" It was this combination of arrogance, brutality, and media flair that defined John Gotti's reign, and ultimately contributed to the fall of the old-school American mafia. He died in prison from throat cancer, I believe. Eventually, in the 1980s, a serious blow was dealt to the Italian mafia. It wasn't completely destroyed, but it was heavily suppressed. However, a new threat was already lurking for the American justice system. Latin American cartels emerged on the scene, Afro-American gangs began forming powerful street organizations, and most importantly, the Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and others like Mara Salvatrucha, who started out in Los Angeles, now basically control half of America. This is a real threat, a new reincarnation of the Mafia. The Mafia became mobile, international, flexible. Cryptocurrency appeared, and with it, methods to launder and transfer money. But the most important thing is that everything became interconnected. When we talk about globalization, we often say Snickers is produced in America. Its packaging and cardboard come from Cambodia, and everything is assembled and shipped from China. Well, the same applies to mafia and criminal structures. Cocaine arrives from Colombia or Mexico to the U.S. Street-level distribution is handled by Latinos. Large-scale distribution is controlled by Italians. Money laundering goes through Panama, and from Panama, the money flows to Latin America, then gets processed through stock exchanges, mostly in Hong Kong, to a lesser extent in Singapore, until it becomes completely untraceable. These funds are then reinvested in Italy, and part of the profits are credited back to the Italian mafia, because they also receive cocaine through the same routes. The whole system functions and thrives. To this day, a structure born in the 1930s still operates in America. In every major U.S. city, there's an Italian family that controls it. In New York, 5 major families hold power: the Genovese family, the Colombo family, the Bonanno family, the Lucchese family, and the Gambino family. The Gambino era lasted from the 1960s to the 1990s. All of this still exists. The Mafia is no longer as omnipotent as it once was, but it still controls a large portion of American organized crime. In Italy, it's the same. Cosa Nostra is the Sicilian Mafia, about which, and its offshoots, I've told you today. The wealthiest Mafia is the Camorra from Naples. They control the construction business, waste disposal, huge amounts of money, drug trafficking, prostitution, human trafficking. A massive number of illegal immigrants from China arrive in shipping containers and are distributed throughout Italy. The third and most brutal clan is the 'Ndrangheta from Calabria. These guys from Calabria definitely watch the series 000. It's well written and well depicted. Virtually all the cocaine coming into Europe is controlled by the 'Ndrangheta, and they are the most ruthless criminal organization. Unlike the Camorra and Cosa Nostra, the 'Ndrangheta does not have a strict vertical hierarchy where there is a boss as the head of the family and everyone reports to him. The 'Ndrangheta is more like a federation of unions, if you will. They have a temporary leader, the Capo Crimine. There are many 'Ndrangheta families, and each family is responsible for its own territory, while the Capo Crimine oversees their activities. He is still elected by all the families in accordance with a ritual held discreetly near a small chapel in a village. Everyone knows where this chapel is. The 'Ndrangheta is the most brutal organization. They eliminate witnesses, shoot at police officers. These are serious, bloodthirsty guys. Their main hitmen now are Albanians, and these guys still control the entire cocaine flow. The fourth group is the Sacra Corona Unita. This is a gang from Apulia that mainly deals with cigarette smuggling and control of prostitution. It is the smallest group among the 4 major Italian clans. Their identity is deeply rooted in religion. The cross is at the center of everything. Their structure is very religious and family-oriented. But this is, let's say, the weakest of the Italian criminal clans. All business, from prostitution to the last marijuana joint, is entirely controlled by organized crime. Police officers, I'm sure, still get paid off. And this criminal economy is enormous, and even, you might laugh, social. During the COVID pandemic, as you know, Italy was economically divided between the wealthy north and the poor south. The north, where Milan and Turin are, has the money. The south, everything from Rome and below, including Bari and Naples, is very poor, with little to no resources. When COVID hit and people truly had nothing to buy food with, according to rumors and journalists' reports, the Camorra, the Neapolitan Mafia, was handing out food, giving people money, feeding them for free. In fact, it is believed in the Camorra that a mafia boss should live in a poor neighborhood. He cannot live in a villa. To this day, they still live in the poorest areas to show their connection to the streets. And during special police operations, locals throw garbage and rocks at the police, resisting in every possible way, because the bond between the streets and the Camorra remains strong. So, if you will, the Camorra played a social role during the pandemic, supporting the population. Mafia bosses even boast that while the Italian government, as usual, abandoned southern Italy to its fate, they stepped up, they helped, they are locals. It's their land. And this is very important. Many Italians still believe the Camorra plays a vital role. It protects them from illegal immigrants because it controls them, keeps outsiders from hurting anyone, and so on. As for the Mafia Rituals, which could have been mentioned at the beginning, I'll talk about them at the end. You understand that in any criminal organization, the law of omertà applies. Usually, when you're initiated into a mafia family, you swear an oath on an image of a saint. They hand you the image, and it's burned in your hands. This symbolizes that if you betray your comrades, you'll burn in hell. There's also a drop of blood. Ritual vows. A mafioso is not allowed to wear a beard or mustache. All of this is part of the tradition. I don't know to what extent it's followed today, but the mafia is still deeply obsessed with these rituals. And the most important ritual is, of course, blood revenge. If you testify against someone from your own group, you will be killed. You cannot speak about the family's affairs with anyone outside of it. And this rule is still strictly followed. The 'ndrangheta, which I've mentioned before, has killed witnesses and oath-breakers without a second thought. Everyone knows it's better not to snitch or testify against them, because you'll be dead. Another point worth mentioning is the series Gomorrah, which was originally a book written by a Neapolitan journalist. Apparently, for the rest of his life, he'll be traveling with bodyguards, because he used to drink and socialize with his Camorra friends, and then wrote a book about them without their approval. When the film Gomorrah premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, he was escorted by 3 federal agents. That's how serious it is. And finally, I want to recall a funny old Soviet comedy called The Adventures of Italians in Russia. There was a goofy Italian mafioso character named Rosario Agro, who shouted absurd things like, "No one escapes from Rosario Agro," right as someone was escaping from him. And at one point, he says the line, "The mafia is immortal." And really, think about it. So many laws have been passed in countries like the US, in Europe, in Italy. Yet the mafia still exists. And it's not just in Italy or America. If you ask, who's running the criminal business in Australia? I'll tell you, it's guys from the 'ndrangheta. 4 families were sent to Australia. What are they doing there, besides drug trafficking? Cocaine is expensive to transport and a loose product, so instead they import Chinese amphetamines and various synthetic drugs. What else? There's a big fruit-picking industry. Fruits are sold at markets, and who gets paid for that? The Italian mob. All of this still exists in Australia. In Canada, this business is also run by Italians. You might laugh, but even in the UK, where they have their own fairly serious mobs, the 'ndrangheta is active, and they have their representatives there too. It's a system that works in collaboration with the Colombians. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Slavic criminal groups appeared, Russian, Ukrainian, and they also started working with the mafia. There are also two major criminal organizations I haven't talked about today, simply because time isn't infinite. The Japanese Yakuza and the Chinese Triads. These are also extremely powerful cartels that have ties to both the Italian and American mafias. Then there are the Colombians. But most importantly, the strongest force in that part of the world today is the Mexican cartels. And it's all interconnected. These people meet with each other. When people talk about a world government, well, half of the logistical decisions are made by these guys, because, through front companies and shell owners, they actually own shares in major businesses. Just look at everything that's going on. Take drugs, for example. Every week we read headlines like 300 kilos, 120 kilos, tons of cocaine seized. Well, how is it all being transported? It's not like people are smuggling this stuff in their stomachs into the United States. They say, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration is the toughest agency in the world. Really? Then how is it that 120 tons of cocaine make it into the U.S. every month? So either the DEA isn't that tough, or they're in on it. That's a reasonable assumption. In any case, the system works, and I believe it will keep working for the rest of our lives. Wherever there is black money, there will always be people who control that black money. And since the state is unwilling to give up its monopoly on violence, but may occasionally lease it out for an indefinite period, the mafia will always exist. That's the story. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss new episodes.